My name is Brianna Foster, I'm 26 years old, and today I'm about to do something that will destroy my family forever. Standing outside the federal courthouse in Manhattan, I clutched the final piece of evidence in my trembling hands, bank documents proving my own father stole $12 million using my identity. The morning sun reflects off the courthouse steps as I watch expensive cars pull up, disgorging teams of lawyers in $1,000 suits. Then I see him. Richard Foster, my dad, stepping out of a black limousine with his legal army, his eyes meeting mine across the plaza with a look that could freeze hell itself. This is it. Before we dive into this insane story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button if you're ready for a wild ride, and don't forget to subscribe because trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. This story has more twists than a pretzel factory, and I promise you won't see the ending coming. Growing up as a Foster meant living in a world most people only see in movies. Our penthouse overlooked Central Park, my allowance could buy a car every month, and my father Richard Foster was the kind of man whose name appeared on the business pages of the New York Times. He built his empire in real estate, turning abandoned warehouses into luxury condominiums and empty lots into shopping centers that generated millions. But our perfect family portrait had cracks that ran deeper than the foundation of our Manhattan Tower. My mother died when I was 12 years old, a sudden brain aneurysm that shattered our world in a single afternoon. I remember coming home from school to find ambulances and my father crying, the only time I'd ever seen tears on Richard Foster's face. 6 months later, he married Helena, a woman 20 years younger with ice blue eyes and the kind of beauty that came with a price tag. She brought her own baggage in the form of social climbing ambitions and a son from her previous marriage who would become my stepbrother Connor. Richard always played the perfect father role after Mom's death. He'd take me to Broadway shows, buy me designer clothes I didn't want, and promise that everything he built would someday be mine. "You're my blood, Brianna," he'd say during our rare quiet moments. "This empire will be yours when I'm gone." Helena would smile sweetly during these conversations, but I caught the calculating look in her eyes when she thought nobody was watching. Connor, 2 years younger than me, seemed genuinely nice but clearly lived in Helena's shadow, doing whatever she asked without question. I chose to study finance in college, partly because I wanted to understand the business that had consumed my father's life and partly because I genuinely enjoyed the complexity of numbers and markets. After graduation, I landed a position as a financial analyst at Wells Fargo, determined to make my own way rather than ride on the Foster name. It was there, during a routine audit of high-value accounts, that my world came crashing down. The account appeared on my screen like any other, just another set of numbers in an endless spreadsheet. But something made me look twice. The name read Brianna M. Foster, and showed a balance that made my breath catch in my throat. $12,400,037. I stared at the screen, certain there had to be a mistake. I'd never opened an account with this much money. I'd never opened any account that wasn't my basic checking and savings. My hands shook as I dug deeper into the transaction history. Money flowing in from various LLC accounts, all connected to Foster Properties and its subsidiaries. Real estate deals, development loans, tax shelters, all using my social security number and forged signatures that looked remarkably like my handwriting. The dates went back 5 years, starting when I was still in college and had no idea these accounts existed. That night, I confronted him at our weekly family dinner. The dining room felt bigger than usual as I sat across from Richard, Helena, and Connor, the crystal chandelier casting shadows that seemed to dance with my growing dread. I placed printouts of the bank statements on the mahogany table like evidence in a courtroom. "What is this?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Richard barely glanced at the papers before his face hardened into the expression he used during hostile business negotiations. "You wouldn't understand the complexities of real estate finance, sweetheart. This is how business works." "Business doesn't work by stealing your daughter's identity," I shot back. Helena set down her wine glass with deliberate precision. "Brianna, darling, your father has given you everything. Perhaps a little gratitude would be appropriate." Connor kept his eyes on his plate, but I could see the confusion in his posture. Even he seemed uncomfortable with the tension filling the room. I never agreed to any of this, I continued, pointing at the statements. You used my name, my credit, my identity to move money around for 5 years. Do you have any idea what this could do to my career? Richard's laugh was cold and sharp. Your career? The career I made possible by paying for your education and using my connections to get you that job? Everything you have, everything you are, exists because of me. The words hit like physical blows, but I forced myself to stand my ground. That doesn't give you the right to commit fraud using my identity. Fraud? Richard's voice rose dangerously. I built this family's wealth through decades of hard work and smart investments. If you can't appreciate the sacrifices I've made, then maybe you don't deserve to be part of this family. Helena reached across the table to squeeze Richard's hand in a gesture of support that made my stomach turn. Perhaps Brianna needs some time to think about what really matters, she said sweetly, but her eyes held all the warmth of a winter storm. Connor finally looked up, his young face torn between loyalty to his mother and some instinct that told him this wasn't right. Maybe we should just talk about this calmly, he suggested quietly. There's nothing calm about stealing $12 million, I replied, gathering the papers. And there's nothing to discuss. This ends now, or I'm going to the authorities. Richard stood so abruptly his chair scraped against the hardwood floor. You ungrateful little bitch. After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me? Get out. Get out of my house right now. Helena's smile widened as she watched me gather my things, and I realized this confrontation had played out exactly as she'd hoped. Connor looked like he wanted to say something, but one glance from his mother silenced him completely. As I walked toward the elevator, my father's voice followed me down the hallway. If you breathe one word of this to anyone, I'll destroy you. Don't test me, Brianna. You have no idea what I'm capable of. The elevator doors closed on what remained of my family, and I knew there was no going back. What I didn't know was that Richard's threats weren't just words, they were promises he intended to keep. Within 24 hours, Richard Foster showed me exactly what he was capable of. I woke up to find my credit cards declined at the coffee shop near my apartment. When I called the bank, a polite representative informed me that all my accounts had been frozen due to suspicious activity reported by the primary account holder. My father had somehow gotten himself listed as the primary on accounts I'd opened myself, using his financial influence to convince the bank that I was the one engaged in fraudulent behavior. By noon, I received a text message that made my blood run cold. You have 24 hours to remove your belongings from the penthouse. Security has been instructed not to allow you access after that time. The message came from Helena's phone, but I could practically hear my father's voice in every word. I spent that afternoon packing my entire life into suitcases and boxes while Helena supervised with the cold efficiency of a prison warden. Connor helped quietly, his face showing genuine distress at what was happening, but he didn't dare speak against his mother's directions. Richard was conveniently absent, handling urgent business that kept him away from the emotional fallout of banishing his only biological child. You know, darling, Helena said as I packed my mother's jewelry into a small velvet box, this could have all been avoided if you'd just been reasonable. Your father only wanted what was best for the family. Best for your family, you mean, I replied, not looking up from my task. Connor and I are his family now. You made your choice when you decided to bite the hand that fed you. The cruelty in her voice was breathtaking, but what hurt more was the truth buried in her words. I had lost my place in this family the moment I challenged Richard's authority, and Helena was simply making it official. I moved into a studio apartment in Queens, a far cry from the luxury I'd grown up with but all I could afford on my analyst salary. The walls were thin, the neighbors loud, and the radiator made sounds like a dying animal, but it was mine. For the first time in my life, I was truly independent, and despite everything, that felt like a small victory. The victory didn't last long. Within a week, rumors began circulating at Wells Fargo about my family troubles. Colleagues who had been friendly suddenly avoided me in the hallways. My supervisor, Janet Morrison, called me into her office with an expression that mixed sympathy with professional concern. Brianna, I need to ask you about some allegations that have come to our attention, she began carefully. What kind of allegations? There are concerns about your involvement in some questionable financial activities. Nothing confirmed, you understand, but given your position here and access to sensitive information, we need to be cautious. My heart sank as I realized what was happening. My father is behind this, isn't he? Janet's silence was answer enough. Richard Foster's influence extended far beyond real estate, and he was using every connection he had to destroy my professional reputation. The man who had once promised me the world was now systematically dismantling my life piece by piece. That evening, I sat in my tiny apartment eating takeout Chinese food and trying to figure out my next move. I had evidence of my father's crimes, but he had money, power, and connections that reached into every corner of New York's financial district. Going up against him felt like David facing Goliath, except David had been disowned and blacklisted by his entire family. Then I remembered Tommy Chen. Tommy had been my best friend in college before a drunk driver took his life during our senior year. His older brother Marcus had become a successful lawyer specializing in white-collar crime, and he'd always told me to call if I ever needed help. At Tommy's funeral, he'd pulled me aside and said, "My brother loved you like a sister. If anyone ever hurts you, you call me." Tommy would have wanted me to protect his family. I'd kept his card all these years, never imagining I'd need it. Now, staring at the crumpled business card I'd found in my old jewelry box, I realized Marcus Chen might be my only chance at justice. The law offices of Chen and Associates occupied a modest space in Lower Manhattan, a stark contrast to the gleaming towers where my father conducted his business. Marcus had aged well since I'd last seen him, his black hair showing distinguished touches of gray at the temples, but his eyes still held the same kindness I remembered from our college days. "Brianna," he said, standing to greet me with a genuine smile. "It's been too long. Though I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." I laid out the entire story, showing him the bank documents, the forged signatures, and the evidence of money laundering that I'd uncovered. Marcus listened without interruption, his lawyer's mind clearly analyzing every detail. "This is serious," he said finally. "We're not just talking about identity theft. Your father has been using your name to hide income from the IRS and potentially wash money from questionable sources. The federal penalties alone could put him away for decades. But can we prove it? He's got more lawyers than some countries have armies." Marcus smiled grimly. "He's also gotten careless. These documents show a pattern of fraud that goes back years. More importantly, he's continued the activity even after you discovered it. That shows intent and a willingness to compound his crimes. What's our next step?" "We file both criminal and civil complaints. I'll handle this pro bono. Tommy would have wanted me to help, and frankly, I've been looking for a case that would let me take down someone like your father." As I left Marcus's office that day, I felt hope for the first time since this nightmare began. I had an ally, I had evidence, and I had the truth on my side. What I didn't know was that Richard Foster was already planning his counterattack, and it would be more vicious than anything I could have imagined. The first sign came the next morning when I found my car tires slashed in the parking garage of my apartment building. A note tucked under the windshield wiper read, "Drop this now or it gets worse." The handwriting wasn't Richard's, but I recognized Helena's elegant script. By that afternoon, Marcus called with disturbing news. "Someone broke into my office last night. They were professionals, no obvious signs of forced entry, but several files are missing, including the preliminary research I'd done on your case." "How is that possible?" "Your father has connections I'm still discovering. But don't worry, I keep duplicates of everything in a secure location. They may have slowed us down, but they haven't stopped us." That night, I barely slept. Every sound in the hallway made me jump, every car that passed seemed to slow down near my building. Richard had always been ruthless in business, but I was beginning to understand that he was willing to use those same tactics against his own daughter. The realization that came to me in the dark hours before dawn was terrifying in its clarity. This wasn't just about money or business or even family pride. This was about power, and Richard Foster would destroy anyone who threatened his carefully constructed empire, including me. The lawsuit Marcus filed on my behalf hit the New York legal community like a bomb. Richard Foster wasn't just another wealthy businessman, he was a pillar of the real estate establishment with friends in City Hall and connections that stretched back generations. When the papers were served at his office, it made the business section of 3 major newspapers within hours. Richard's response was swift and overwhelming. He retained Blackstone and Associates, the most prestigious and ruthless law firm in Manhattan, known for representing Fortune 500 companies in cases where winning wasn't just preferred but absolutely necessary. The senior partner, Victoria Blackstone herself, took personal charge of Richard's defense, bringing with her a reputation for destroying opponents both in court and in their personal lives. Within days of the filing, I found myself facing a countersuit that accused me of extortion, defamation, and conspiracy to defraud my own father. The legal documents painted me as an ungrateful daughter who had fabricated evidence to steal from the man who had raised and supported me. According to their version of events, I was a troubled young woman with a history of mental instability and drug abuse, lies that were presented with such conviction that even I began to question my own memories. "They're going for character assassination," Marcus explained as we reviewed the countersuit in his office. "It's a classic tactic when the facts aren't on your side. They'll try to make you look so unstable and vindictive that no jury will believe your version of events. But we have evidence. We have the bank records, the forged signatures, everything. Evidence can be questioned, challenged, explained away by expensive experts. What we need is something they can't dispute, more documentation, more witnesses, or better yet, a confession." That's when things took a turn I never could have predicted. Connor reached out to me through a mutual friend from high school, asking if we could meet somewhere private. Despite everything that had happened, he was still my brother, and the part of me that remembered him as a confused kid caught between loyalty to his mother and basic human decency agreed to see him. We met at a small cafe in Brooklyn, far from the Manhattan circles where Richard's influence held sway. Connor looked older than his 22 years, with dark circles under his eyes and a nervousness that seemed to vibrate through his entire body. "I know you probably hate me," he began without preamble. "And you have every right to. But I need you to know that I never wanted any of this to happen." "Then why did you let it? Why didn't you speak up when Helena threw me out?" Connor stared into his coffee cup as if it held answers to questions he'd been asking himself. "Because she's all I've ever known. My real father died when I was 5, and Richard has been good to me, given me everything. Helena always said that family loyalty was the most important thing, and I believed her. And now I'm starting to realize that maybe there's a difference between loyalty and being blind to what's right in front of you." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. "I found these in Helena's home office. I think you need to see them." Inside the envelope were copies of documents I'd never seen before, correspondence between Richard and several offshore banking institutions, records of property purchases under shell company names, and most damaging of all, a series of emails between Richard and Helena discussing how to handle the Brianna situation, if I ever discovered their activities. One email in particular made my blood run cold. "If she pushes this any further, we may need to consider more permanent solutions. There are people who owe me favors, and accidents happen every day in New York. Connor, do you understand what this means?" "It means they're not just trying to destroy your reputation," he said quietly. "They're actually talking about hurting you. And I can't be part of that, family or no family. Will you testify? Will you go on record with what you've seen and heard?" Connor's struggle was written across his face, years of conditioning warring with basic human decency. "If I do this, Helena will destroy me. She has dirt on everyone in our family, including things about my real father's death that could ruin me." "What kind of things?" "Things that would make you understand why I've been so afraid of her for so long." Before I could press him further, Connor's phone buzzed with a text message. His face went pale as he read it. "I have to go. Helena knows I'm not where I said I'd be." He stood quickly, then paused. "Brianna, be careful. Helena isn't just greedy, she's dangerous. I think she might have done things, terrible things, to get where she is now. What are you talking about? Your mother. The brain aneurysm. I overheard Helena on the phone once, talking to someone about how easy it had been to solve the problem of Richard's first wife. I was young and didn't understand what she meant, but now. The implication hit me like a physical blow. Are you saying Helena murdered my mother? I'm saying I think you should have that conversation with someone who knows about these things. And Brianna? Watch your back. If they're willing to kill once, they'll do it again. Connor left without another word, but the envelope he'd given me felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I sat in that cafe for another hour, reading through the documents and trying to process what they meant. My father wasn't just a white-collar criminal, he was potentially an accomplice to murder. And the woman he'd married 6 months after my mother's death might have orchestrated the whole thing. That night, I called Marcus and arranged to meet him at his office, even though it was nearly midnight. The building was eerily quiet as we spread Connor's documents across the conference table, but what we found there would change everything about our case. This changes the entire scope of what we're dealing with, Marcus said after reviewing the offshore banking records. We're not just looking at tax evasion and identity theft. This is money laundering on an international scale, with connections to organizations that the FBI has been investigating for years. And my mother? That's something we'll need to investigate very carefully. If Helena was involved in your mother's death, we're talking about murder, which means this case just became about more than money. As we worked through the night, analyzing documents and building our strategy, I felt a strange mix of fear and determination. The truth was uglier than I'd ever imagined, but it was also more powerful than any lie Richard and Helena could construct. By dawn, we had enough evidence to not only win our case but to potentially send both Richard and Helena to prison for the rest of their lives. What we didn't know was that Helena had already decided we knew too much, and she was prepared to use any means necessary to silence us permanently. The war between my family and me was no longer just about money or pride. It had become a fight for survival, and only one side was going to walk away from it intact. The attempt on my life came exactly 1 week after Connor gave me the documents. I was walking home from the subway after another long day of reviewing case files with Marcus when a black SUV jumped the curb and aimed directly for me. Only my paranoia, a new and unwelcome companion since this whole nightmare began, saved my life. I dove behind a parked car as the SUV roared past, close enough that I felt the heat from its engine. The driver never slowed down, never looked back, and the license plate was obscured by mud that looked deliberately applied. I sat on the sidewalk for 10 minutes, shaking and trying to convince myself it had been an accident, but deep down I knew better. Helena's threat in that email hadn't been hyperbole. They were actually trying to kill me. Marcus insisted I file a police report, but Detective Rivera at the local precinct looked at me with the weary expression of someone who'd heard too many paranoid stories from too many people with family money problems. Miss Foster, without witnesses or camera footage, there's not much we can do. Could have been a drunk driver, someone texting, any number of things. Detective, my stepmother is in emails talking about permanent solutions to the problem I represent. This wasn't random. Bring me something concrete and we'll talk. Until then, maybe consider staying with friends for a while. Friends. The word felt hollow. Most of my college friends had drifted away after graduation, absorbed by their own careers and relationships. The few remaining had grown distant since news of my family situation started circulating through New York's social circles. When your father is accused of major financial crimes, people tend to assume guilt by association. That's when Jessica Wright entered my life like a guardian angel with a press badge. Jessica was an investigative journalist with the Washington Post who had been tracking money laundering operations connected to Eastern European crime syndicates. She'd noticed Richard Foster's name appearing in connection with several shell companies her sources had identified, and my lawsuit had confirmed suspicions she'd been developing for months. Your father isn't just stealing money, she explained over coffee at a diner that felt safely anonymous in its ordinariness. He's providing services to some very dangerous people. The Russians, specifically, had been using American real estate to wash money from arms dealing, human trafficking, and drug operations. How do you know all this? Sources in federal law enforcement who have been building cases against these networks for years. Your father's operation is small compared to what they're really after, but it's a crucial link in the chain. If we can prove his connections, it could bring down a network that spans 3 continents. Jessica was offering something I desperately needed, an ally with resources and connections that could match Richard's influence. But she was also asking me to escalate a family dispute into something that would attract the attention of international criminals who killed people for less than what I was already doing to them. What do you need from me? Access to more financial records, anything Connor might have seen or heard about Helena's activities, and most importantly, your willingness to go public with everything. I want to write a series that exposes not just your father's crimes, but the entire network he's been serving. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Stop digging or the next car won't miss. Jessica read the message over my shoulder and her expression hardened. That settles it. You're in danger whether you cooperate with me or not. At least this way, the truth gets told even if something happens to you. That night, I called Connor from a burner phone Jessica had given me. Helena had increased security around the penthouse and was monitoring his communications, but he managed to slip away to a pay phone near Columbia University. They know you have the documents, he said without preamble. Helena found out I was the one who took them, and she's been questioning me for hours about what else I might have seen or heard. Connor, you need to get out of there. Come stay with me, or better yet, let Marcus put you in protective custody. I can't. Helena has too much leverage over me. But I can tell you something else, she's planning to leave the country. I overheard her booking flights to Switzerland under a fake passport. She's moving money out of the offshore accounts as fast as she can. When? Soon. Maybe within the week. Brianna, I think she's going to try to kill you before she leaves. I heard her on the phone talking about cleaning up loose ends and she was looking at me when she said it. I think she plans to get rid of both of us. The line went dead, and I never heard from Connor again. What happened next, I learned later from Jessica's investigative work. Helena had Connor committed to a private psychiatric facility upstate, claiming he was having a psychotic break and posed a danger to himself and others. The facility was expensive, discreet, and had a policy of not allowing outside contact for the first 30 days of treatment. Marcus tried to intervene legally, but Helena had prepared her case well. She had documentation of Connor's increasingly erratic behavior, testimony from family staff about his paranoid delusions, and most damaging of all, a recording of our phone conversation that she'd somehow obtained and edited to make Connor sound genuinely unstable. We'll get him out, Marcus promised, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. Helena had outmaneuvered us again, and now the only witness to her activities was locked away where he couldn't testify against her. That's when Jessica's investigation took a dramatic turn. Her sources in the FBI informed her that they'd been building a RICO case against the Russian money laundering network, and they wanted to offer me something unprecedented, witness protection in exchange for my cooperation in bringing down not just Richard and Helena, but the entire criminal organization they'd been serving. Think about what this means, Special Agent Sarah Chin explained during a clandestine meeting in a safe house in New Jersey. We can protect you, we can ensure justice for your mother if she was indeed murdered, and we can stop a criminal network that's responsible for countless deaths and untold suffering. And if I say no? Then you're on your own against people who have already tried to kill you once and will certainly try again. Miss Foster, these aren't white-collar criminals who fight with lawsuits and accountants. These are people who solve problems with bullets and car bombs. The decision should have been easy, but accepting FBI protection meant acknowledging that my life as Brianna Foster was over. I would have to testify against my own father, face cross-examination from the best lawyers money could buy, and live with the knowledge that I'd been the instrument of my family's destruction. As I sat in that safe house, surrounded by federal agents and journalists, I thought about the little girl who'd once believed her father was a hero, who'd trusted that family meant something more than money and power. That girl was gone forever, replaced by someone harder and more suspicious, but also someone who understood the difference between loyalty and complicity. I'll do it, I said finally. But I want guarantees. I want Connor protected, I want the truth about my mother investigated, and I want Helena Foster to face justice for everything she's done. Agent Chen nodded grimly. Then let's bring them all down. What none of US knew was that Helena had been monitoring federal communications through contacts in the Russian network, and she learned about my cooperation hours before our meeting ended. By the time the FBI moved to arrest her, she was already gone, leaving behind only a note addressed to me: "You should have stayed, family, little girl. Now you'll learn what it means to make enemies of people like us." The hunt for Helena Foster had begun, but she had a head start and connections in countries that didn't extradite to the United States. More importantly, she'd left behind a network of associates who viewed my betrayal as a personal insult that needed to be answered with violence. The war I'd started with a simple question about bank statements had escalated into something that would determine whether justice existed for people with enough money to buy their way out of consequences. And in the center of it all was the terrifying realization that the woman who'd helped raise me was not just a criminal, but a killer who would stop at nothing to protect her secrets. The FBI safe house in upstate New York felt like a prison built for my protection. Agent Chen had assigned a full detail to watch over me while they built their case, but the isolation was almost as suffocating as the fear that had driven me to accept their offer. For 3 weeks, my world consisted of debriefing sessions, document reviews, and the constant presence of agents who treated me with professional kindness but maintained the emotional distance necessary for their jobs. Jessica Wright was my only real connection to the outside world. She visited twice a week, updating me on her investigation and helping me process the psychological impact of learning that my entire childhood had been built on lies and murder. It was during one of these visits that she delivered news that changed everything I thought I knew about my mother's death. "I found Dr. Patricia Henley," Jessica said, settling into the chair across from my small dining table. "She was your mother's neurologist at Mount Sinai, and she's been carrying guilt about her death for 14 years. "What kind of guilt?" "The kind that comes from knowing something was wrong but not being able to prove it. Your mother came to see Dr. Henley 2 weeks before her death, complaining of severe headaches and vision problems. Dr. Henley ordered a complete neurological workup, but your mother died before the results came back. That doesn't sound unusual for someone who had an aneurysm. Except the autopsy showed something Dr. Henley had never seen before. The aneurysm was in a location that typically develops over years, but the tissue damage suggested it had formed rapidly, almost overnight. Dr. Henley suspected poisoning but couldn't prove it, and the medical examiner was under pressure to close the case quickly." Jessica pulled out a manila folder containing copies of medical records I'd never seen. Dr. Henley kept copies of everything because she never believed the official cause of death. She's been waiting 14 years for someone to ask the right questions. The medical terminology was complex, but Jessica's explanation made the implications clear. My mother hadn't died from natural causes. Someone had poisoned her with a substance that could cause rapid aneurysm formation, making murder look like a tragic medical event. "There's more," Jessica continued. "I tracked down Helena's first husband, Charles Morrison. He died of a sudden heart attack at age 45, despite being in perfect health. The death certificate lists natural causes, but the symptoms described by witnesses match certain rare toxins that can trigger cardiac arrest. Helena killed her first husband too. And probably others. I found 3 suspicious deaths connected to people who crossed Helena over the past 20 years. She's not just greedy, she's a serial killer who uses her beauty and intelligence to get close to wealthy men, then eliminates anyone who threatens her access to their money." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I'd grown up calling this woman my stepmother, eating dinners across from her, letting her comfort me during the difficult teenage years after my mother's death. And all the while, she'd been the one responsible for making me motherless in the first place. "We need to tell Agent Chen immediately," I said, reaching for my phone. "I already have. The FBI is reopening your mother's case and coordinating with international authorities to track Helena's movements. But there's something else you need to know." Jessica's expression grew even more serious, if that was possible. "Connor escaped from the psychiatric facility." "What do you mean, escaped?" "He walked out 3 days ago. No one knows how. The place was supposed to be secure, with electronic monitoring and specialized staff. But Connor just vanished, and Helena received a call on her private line about an hour after he disappeared. You think she helped him escape? I think Connor was never as innocent as he appeared. Look at these. Jessica spread out a series of photographs showing Connor at various locations around New York over the past 6 months. My private investigator has been tracking Helena's associates, and Connor appears in surveillance photos with several of them. He wasn't just her stepson, he was actively involved in her operations. The betrayal cut deeper than anything Richard or Helena had done. Connor had played the role of the conflicted young man caught between loyalties, but he'd been working with Helena all along. His emotional struggle, his apparent guilt over betraying me, even his concern for my safety, all of it had been performance designed to keep me trusting him while he fed information back to Helena. The documents he gave you were real, Jessica continued, but they were also incomplete. Helena let him pass them to you because they only told part of the story. The full truth is much worse, and she wanted to control exactly what you learned and when. What's the full truth? Your father isn't just laundering money for the Russians. He's been helping them move people, specifically, young women trafficked for the sex trade. Helena has been recruiting victims through her social connections, using charity events and fashion shows to identify vulnerable girls from broken families. The scope of their crimes was so vast it made my head spin. Identity theft and tax evasion seemed almost quaint compared to human trafficking and multiple murders. I'd been fighting to recover stolen money while my family had been destroying lives on an international scale. Where does this leave our case? Stronger than ever, but also more dangerous. The Russians don't just lose money when operations like this get shut down, they lose millions in revenue and, more importantly, face in front of their competitors. They've already put a bounty on your head, and now that Connor is free, Helena has someone who knows your habits and weaknesses. That night, Agent Shin moved me to a new safe house with additional security measures. But as I lay in an unfamiliar bed in an anonymous room, I realized that no amount of protection could shield me from the psychological impact of learning that everyone I'd ever trusted had been lying to me for my entire life. My father wasn't just corrupt, he was complicit in trafficking human beings. My stepmother wasn't just greedy, she was a calculating murderer who'd killed my mother to steal her life. And my brother wasn't just confused, he was an active participant in crimes that destroyed innocent lives. The next morning brought news that made the situation even more desperate. Connor had contacted several major news outlets, claiming that I was a mentally unstable drug addict who had fabricated evidence against my loving family to cover up my own crimes. He provided what appeared to be medical records showing a history of psychiatric treatment, drug rehabilitation, and violent outbursts, all expertly forged but convincing enough to plant seeds of doubt about my credibility. They're trying to destroy your reputation before the trial starts, Marcus explained during a secure video call. If they can convince a jury that you're an unreliable witness with a history of mental illness and substance abuse, it won't matter how much evidence we have. But you have Connor's original documents, the medical records about my mother, Jessica's investigation. All of which they'll claim are fabrications created by a disturbed young woman with access to sophisticated document fraud resources through her job at Wells Fargo. Remember, they have unlimited money to hire the best expert witnesses and the most convincing character witnesses. The walls were closing in from every direction. My family had turned against me completely, the media was beginning to question my mental state, and somewhere out there, Helena Foster was planning my death with the help of international criminals who viewed murder as just another business expense. But I still had one advantage they couldn't take away, the truth. And sometimes, when everything else fails, the truth is enough to bring down even the most powerful conspiracies. The question was whether I would live long enough to tell it. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan had seen some of the most significant trials in American legal history, but the Foster case attracted media attention that surprised even veteran court reporters. Outside, protesters held signs reading, "Justice for Trafficking Victims," while counter-protesters hired by Richard's legal team carried banners proclaiming, "Family Loyalty Matters." The circus atmosphere made it nearly impossible for me to enter the building without being photographed from every angle. Inside, the courtroom felt like a gladiatorial arena. Richard sat at the defendant's table wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, his silver hair styled with the same precision he'd always brought to business meetings. Beside him, Victoria Blackstone and her team of associates created an intimidating wall of legal expertise that money could buy. They exuded confidence, treating the proceedings like an expensive chess game they fully expected to win. On our side, Marcus looked small by comparison, accompanied only by a junior associate and the weight of evidence that felt both overwhelming and somehow fragile in the face of such polished opposition. I sat in the gallery, officially designated as the primary witness for the prosecution, watching my father for any sign of the man who had once read me bedtime stories and taught me to ride a bicycle in Central Park. Judge Margaret Thompson commanded the courtroom with the authority of someone who had presided over organized crime trials for 20 years. She made it clear from the opening statements that she wouldn't tolerate grandstanding from either side and expected all parties to focus on facts rather than family drama. The prosecution's opening statement laid out a methodical case. Richard Foster had systematically stolen his daughter's identity to hide income from federal authorities while facilitating money laundering operations for international criminal organizations. The evidence included bank records, forged documents, and testimony from federal agents who had been tracking these activities for years. Victoria Blackstone's opening was a masterclass in character assassination disguised as legal defense. She painted me as an unstable young woman who had fabricated evidence to destroy the father who had loved and supported her despite her numerous personal problems. According to her version of events, I had used my position at Wells Fargo to create false documents and had manipulated well-meaning law enforcement officers into believing an elaborate fantasy born from drug-induced paranoia and mental illness. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she concluded, this case is not about financial crimes or international conspiracies. It's about a deeply troubled young woman who chose revenge over family love, and who has convinced herself that lies are truth through years of substance abuse and psychological instability. The first week of testimony focused on financial evidence. FBI forensic accountants walked the jury through money trails that connected Richard's real estate empire to offshore accounts in countries known for banking secrecy. The paper trail was complex but damning, millions of dollars flowing through shell companies, real estate purchases that served no legitimate business purpose, and transactions timed to coincide with known criminal activities. Marcus had done excellent work preparing these witnesses, and their testimony was clear, methodical, and devastating. But Blackstone's cross-examinations revealed the weakness in purely circumstantial evidence. She forced the witnesses to admit that money flowing through offshore accounts wasn't inherently illegal, that real estate transactions often involved complex financing arrangements, and that correlation didn't necessarily prove causation. The second week brought testimony from Dr. Patricia Henley about my mother's suspicious death. Her medical opinion was compelling. The aneurysm showed characteristics consistent with induced rather than natural development, and the rapid onset of symptoms suggested external causation. But under cross-examination, Blackstone methodically destroyed her credibility by highlighting the 14-year gap between the death and her current testimony, suggesting that financial incentives from the prosecution had motivated her to reinterpret old medical data. Henley, Blackstone said during a particularly brutal cross-examination, "Isn't it true that you've been approached by multiple parties over the years offering money for testimony that would support conspiracy theories about Mrs. Foster's death?" "I've never accepted money for my medical opinions." "That wasn't my question, doctor." "Haven't you been approached with offers of compensation for testimony that would support the theory that Mrs. Foster was murdered?" Henley's hesitation was barely perceptible, but it was enough. "I may have received inquiries, but I've never changed my medical opinion based on financial incentives." "So you have been offered money to support the murder theory. And now you're testifying for the prosecution in a case where that same theory is central to their argument against Mr. Foster. Don't you think the jury deserves to know about these financial incentives when evaluating the reliability of your testimony?" By the end of her testimony, Dr. Henley's medical opinion seemed less like scientific fact and more like speculation motivated by money and publicity. Blackstone had systematically planted doubt about every aspect of her conclusions without explicitly calling her a liar. Jessica Wright's testimony about Helena's criminal history should have been the prosecution's strongest moment, but Blackstone was ready for that too. She objected to almost every line of questioning as hearsay, speculation, or irrelevant to the charges against Richard. Judge Thompson sustained most of the objections, leaving Jessica able to testify only about documented facts rather than her broader investigation into Helena's activities. The most devastating moment came when Connor took the stand for the defense. He walked into the courtroom looking younger than his 22 years, wearing a conservative suit that made him appear more like a prep school student than the international criminal conspirator I now knew him to be. His testimony was a masterpiece of manipulation, delivered with just the right mixture of pain and reluctance. "I love my sister," he said, looking directly at the jury with tears in his eyes. "But I've watched her struggle with addiction and mental illness for years. Our family tried to get her help, but she refused treatment and became increasingly paranoid and aggressive toward anyone who tried to intervene." "Can you describe specific incidents where you witnessed this erratic behavior?" Blackstone asked. "There were times when she would disappear for days, coming home clearly under the influence of something. She became obsessed with conspiracy theories about our family, claiming that our stepmother was some kind of criminal mastermind and that our father was involved in international crime syndicates." Connor's voice broke slightly as he continued. "The hardest part was watching her turn these fantasies into elaborate schemes to destroy our family. She would spend hours creating fake documents and building cases for imaginary crimes. When we tried to get her professional help, she became violent and threatened to ruin us all if we didn't give her money to support her drug habit. Every word was a lie delivered with the conviction of truth." Connor had obviously been coached extensively, and his performance was flawless. He provided specific dates and incidents that sounded believable, complete with details that would be impossible to verify but seemed too authentic to be fabricated. When Marcus cross-examined him, Connor maintained his composure perfectly. He admitted that family relationships were complicated but insisted that Richard had always been a loving father who had tried everything possible to help his troubled daughter. He denied any knowledge of illegal financial activities and suggested that any questionable documents I had discovered were likely forgeries I had created myself during drug-induced episodes. "Isn't it true that you provided documents to your sister that showed evidence of money laundering?" Marcus asked. "No, that's not true. I never gave her any business documents. I think she may have stolen files from our father's home office and then altered them to support her delusions. But you testified during your deposition that you had concerns about certain family financial activities." Connor looked confused and slightly hurt. "I never said that. I think there may have been a misunderstanding. I was concerned about Brianna's behavior and her accusations against our family, but I never believed there was any truth to her conspiracy theories." Blackstone's redirect examination allowed Connor to elaborate on his concern for my well-being, his hope that the trial would finally force me to get the psychiatric treatment I needed, and his family's willingness to forgive me and provide support if I would admit my problems and accept help. By the time Connor left the witness stand, the jury was looking at me with sympathy rather than anger. I was no longer the brave whistleblower exposing family crimes. I was a troubled young woman whose addiction and mental illness had driven her to destroy the people who loved her most. That evening, Marcus and I reviewed the day's testimony in a conference room that felt more like a funeral parlor than a legal strategy session. We both knew that Connor's performance had been devastating to our case. Without his support, we had no family insider to corroborate the allegations against Richard. Worse, his testimony had provided a plausible alternative explanation for all of our evidence, the desperate fabrications of someone whose grip on reality had been compromised by drugs and psychological trauma. "We still have your testimony," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're articulate, intelligent, and you know the details of this case better than anyone. If you can connect with the jury, make them see the real person behind these allegations. After Connor's performance, they think I'm a delusional drug addict who fabricated everything. How am I supposed to overcome that? By telling the truth. Sometimes that's enough." But as I prepared for my own testimony, I knew that truth alone might not be sufficient to overcome the doubt that Connor and Blackstone had planted. The next day would determine whether justice existed for people like me, or whether money and influence could successfully rewrite reality itself. The trial wasn't just about guilt or innocence anymore. It had become a test of whether the truth could survive a coordinated assault by people with unlimited resources and no moral constraints. and I was beginning to fear that we were losing. Taking the witness stand felt like stepping into a spotlight that would either vindicate me or complete my destruction. The courtroom was packed with reporters, FBI agents, and spectators who had followed every twist of what the media had dubbed the Foster family war. As I swore to tell the truth, I caught sight of Richard at the defendant's table. For just a moment, his mask of professional composure slipped, and I saw something that might have been regret in his eyes. Marcus led me through my testimony with the careful precision of a surgeon. We started with my childhood, establishing the close relationship I'd had with both parents before my mother's death and the dramatic changes that followed Helena's arrival in our family. I described my education, my career at Wells Fargo, and the discovery of the fraudulent accounts that had started this entire nightmare. Miss Foster, when you first discovered these accounts bearing your name, what was your reaction? I was confused and frightened. I had never opened these accounts, never authorized any of the transactions. My immediate concern was that someone had stolen my identity. And when you confronted your father about these accounts, how did he respond? He became angry and defensive. He told me I didn't understand business and that I should be grateful for everything he'd done for me. When I insisted that using my identity without permission was fraud, he threw me out of the house. Marcus walked me through each piece of evidence methodically, the forged signatures, the offshore accounts, the suspicious timing of transactions. My testimony was detailed and consistent, supported by documentation that painted a clear picture of systematic financial fraud. Then came the cross-examination. Victoria Blackstone approached the witness stand with the predatory grace of someone who had destroyed countless witnesses before me. Her smile was warm and sympathetic, designed to make me lower my guard before she began her assault. Miss Foster, you've been through a tremendous amount of stress over the past year, haven't you? Yes, discovering that my father had stolen my identity and been involved in money laundering was quite stressful. I imagine it would be. And you've had to deal with this stress while also managing some personal challenges, isn't that right? I'm not sure what you mean. Blackstone moved to the evidence table and retrieved a thick folder. I have here medical records from Riverside Treatment Center, showing that you were admitted for substance abuse treatment in 2019. Do you recall that stay? My blood ran cold. I had indeed spent a week at Riverside after a difficult period following a bad breakup, but it had been for anxiety and depression, not substance abuse. I was treated for anxiety, not drug addiction. According to these records, you tested positive for cocaine and prescription drug abuse. The treatment notes describe you as paranoid and delusional, with a tendency to create elaborate conspiracy theories to explain your problems. Those records are false. I was never treated for drug abuse. Blackstone smiled sadly. Miss Foster, isn't it true that addiction often involves denial? The records I'm holding are certified copies from the facility's medical files. Are you suggesting that licensed medical professionals falsified your treatment records? I looked desperately at Marcus, but he could only object to the form of the question, not the devastating content. The records were expertly forged, but proving that would take time we didn't have and resources we couldn't access during cross-examination. I'm suggesting that someone with enough money and influence could arrange to have false records created and placed in medical files. Someone like your father? Yes. Miss Foster, if your father had the power to create false medical records and place them in secure medical facilities, wouldn't he also have the power to create false bank records? Wouldn't he be able to fabricate all the evidence you've presented today? The question was a trap, but refusing to answer would look even worse. The bank records are real. Multiple federal agencies have verified their authenticity. Federal agencies that were initially contacted by you, based on your allegations against your family. Isn't it possible that your initial claims, however sincere, were based on misunderstandings caused by your substance abuse and psychological condition? For the next 2 hours, Blackstone systematically dismantled my credibility. She produced witness statements from former colleagues at Wells Fargo describing erratic behavior, missed deadlines, and concerns about my judgment. She had testimony from neighbors about late-night disturbances and visits from what appeared to be drug dealers. She even had security footage from various locations showing me in what she characterized as obviously impaired states. Every piece of evidence was expertly crafted and probably false, but disproving any of it would have required investigations that weren't possible during cross-examination. Blackstone was constructing an alternative reality where I was the criminal, using my position at a major bank to create fraudulent documents that supported paranoid delusions about my loving family. Miss Foster, isn't it true that you used your access to Wells Fargo's computer systems to create false bank records? No, absolutely not. But you did have access to systems that could generate official-looking bank statements? As part of my job, yes, but I never. And you were familiar with document formatting, signature verification procedures, and the technical aspects of how legitimate bank records are created? That knowledge was necessary for my work, but... So you had both the technical knowledge and system access necessary to create convincing fraudulent bank records. You had motive in the form of anger toward your family and financial desperation caused by your addiction. And you had opportunity through your position at one of the country's largest banks. By the time Blackstone finished with me, I felt like I'd been put through a psychological meat grinder. Every aspect of my character, my competence, and my credibility had been challenged with evidence that looked authentic enough to convince a jury, even though I knew it was all fabricated. Marcus did his best during redirect examination to rehabilitate my testimony, but the damage was severe. I had been transformed from a credible whistleblower into a troubled young woman whose accusations seemed more like the desperate fantasies of someone whose life had spiraled out of control. The final blow came during Blackstone's closing argument. She painted a picture of a family tragedy. A successful businessman whose only crime was loving his damaged daughter too much to see the destruction she was capable of causing. According to her version of events, Richard Foster was the victim of an elaborate fraud perpetrated by someone who had used her position at a major financial institution to create evidence supporting her drug-fueled paranoid fantasies. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Blackstone concluded, the evidence shows that Richard Foster is not a criminal. He's a father whose love for his troubled daughter blinded him to the depths of her psychological problems. The real crime here is the systematic fraud Miss Foster committed against her own family, using sophisticated technical knowledge and access to financial systems to create a house of mirrors designed to destroy the people who raised and supported her. Marcus's closing argument focused on the evidence, the money trails, the forged signatures, the connections to international criminal organizations. But I could see in the jury's faces that they were no longer certain what to believe. Blackstone had created reasonable doubt not just about Richard's guilt, but about the reliability of the evidence itself. As the jury retired to deliberate, I sat in the courthouse hallway feeling like everything I'd fought for was slipping away. The truth seemed inadequate against the coordinated assault of unlimited money and professional expertise in the art of deception. That's when everything changed. Agent Shin approached our table with an expression that mixed excitement with grim satisfaction. We just arrested Helena Foster at JFK Airport. She was trying to board a flight to Moscow using a Russian diplomatic passport. Was she carrying anything? A laptop with financial records that corroborate everything you've testified about, plus evidence of crimes that make what we've proven in court look minor by comparison. The laptop contained detailed records of the human trafficking operation, including photographs and personal information about dozens of victims. More importantly for our case, it contained communications between Helena and Richard discussing the specifics of using my identity for money laundering purposes. The evidence was so detailed and so damning that it left no room for alternative explanations or claims of fabrication. 20 minutes later, the jury returned with a verdict that would change everything, guilty on all counts. Richard Foster was convicted of identity theft, money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit human trafficking. The sentence would be 30 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. But the real victory came in what happened after the verdict was read. Helena Foster, faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of life in prison, agreed to cooperate fully with federal authorities in exchange for a plea agreement. Her confession provided details about the murder of my mother, the trafficking operation, and the international criminal network that had been using Richard's real estate empire to wash money. Most importantly, her confession cleared Connor of any significant involvement in the criminal activities. He had been manipulated and used, but he hadn't been a willing participant in the trafficking or money laundering operations. His testimony against me had been coerced through threats against his safety and false information about my intentions. As I walked out of the courthouse that day, I felt a complex mixture of victory and loss. Justice had been served, but the family I'd grown up believing in was gone forever. Richard would spend the rest of his life in prison, Helena faced multiple life sentences, and Connor and I would need to rebuild a relationship that had been shattered by lies and manipulation. But for the first time in over a year, I could sleep without fear. The truth had survived the assault against it, and sometimes, that's the best victory you can hope for. The media attention following the verdict was overwhelming but ultimately liberating. Every major news outlet wanted to interview the daughter who had brought down her own father's criminal empire, but I found myself surprisingly uninterested in fame or public vindication. What mattered was the quiet work of rebuilding a life that had been shattered by the truth. Connor was released from witness protection 3 days after Helena's confession confirmed his limited involvement in the family's crimes. When we met at a small cafe near the courthouse, he looked older than his 22 years, with a wariness in his eyes that reminded me too much of my own reflection. The conversation was awkward at first, weighted down by everything that had been said and done during the trial, but gradually we began to find our way back to the relationship we'd had before Helena poisoned it with lies and manipulation. "I know you probably can't forgive me for what I said on the stand," he began quietly, staring at his untouched coffee. "You were protecting yourself from someone you thought was dangerous. I understand that now. But I hurt you. I said things that weren't true, made you look like someone whose own brother didn't believe her. Yeah, that part really sucked." Connor's smile was tentative but genuine. "Helena showed me edited recordings of conversations she claimed you'd had with federal agents. She made it sound like you were planning to frame me for crimes I didn't even know were happening. I was terrified that helping you would mean going to prison for things I'd never done." "What kind of recordings?" "Conversations where you supposedly told FBI agents that I was the mastermind behind the money laundering and that you were only cooperating to avoid prosecution yourself. The audio was so convincing that I never questioned whether it might be fake." Helena's manipulations had been even more sophisticated than I'd realized. She hadn't just threatened Connor, she'd convinced him that I was the real enemy, that cooperating with her was the only way to protect himself from my supposed betrayal. Understanding that didn't erase the pain of his testimony, but it helped me see him as another victim rather than a willing collaborator. We decided to attend family therapy together, working with Dr. Sarah Martinez, a specialist in family trauma who had experience with cases involving criminal prosecution of family members. The sessions were difficult and sometimes painful, but they helped us understand how Helena had systematically destroyed the trust between us and begin the slow process of rebuilding it. Marcus and I had grown closer during the trial, but we both agreed that any romantic relationship needed to wait until I had time to process everything that had happened. He was patient and understanding, continuing to handle the legal aftermath of the case while giving me space to heal. There were still civil lawsuits to resolve, asset recovery proceedings, and coordination with international authorities tracking the broader criminal network. The most significant change in my life came through the establishment of the Foster Justice Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping victims of financial fraud and human trafficking. The $12 million recovered from the fraudulent accounts became the foundation's initial endowment, along with additional assets seized from Richard's criminal enterprises. Working with trafficking survivors gave me perspective on my own experience that pure self-reflection never could have provided. Women like Maria Santos, who had been trafficked from El Salvador at age 16 and forced to work in massage parlors controlled by the same network that had used my father's real estate holdings, helped me understand that my suffering, while real and significant, was part of a much larger pattern of exploitation. "You used your privilege and access to bring down people who destroyed hundreds of lives," Maria told me during one of our foundation meetings. "That matters more than whatever family relationships you lost along the way." The foundation's work expanded quickly as word spread through victim advocacy networks. We provided legal assistance, financial support, and psychological counseling to people who had been exploited by financial fraudsters and human traffickers. Within 6 months, we were helping over 200 survivors rebuild their lives and pursue justice against their exploiters. Connor joined the Foundation's board after completing his undergraduate degree and undergoing extensive therapy to address the psychological manipulation he'd experienced. His business background and understanding of the financial systems that criminals used made him valuable in developing prevention programs for young people at risk of exploitation. The relationship between Connor and me wasn't the same as it had been before this nightmare began, but it was in many ways stronger. We'd both learned painful lessons about trust, loyalty, and the difference between family bonds and family loyalty. The trust we rebuilt was based on honest communication and mutual respect rather than the assumption that blood relationships automatically created unbreakable bonds. A year after the trial, I received a letter from Richard in federal prison. He'd been transferred to a medium security facility in Pennsylvania after cooperating with additional investigations into international money laundering networks. The letter was handwritten on plain paper, without the expensive stationery that had always characterized his business correspondence. "Brianna," it began, "I know I have no right to contact you, and I understand if you choose not to read this letter. But I need you to know that I never intended for things to go as far as they did. I never wanted you to be hurt, and I certainly never knew that Helena had killed your mother until her confession made it impossible to deny. I started working with questionable people because I was desperate to maintain the lifestyle and status that I thought you deserved. After your mother died, I felt like providing you with material security was the only way I could honor her memory and show my love for you. I know now that I was wrong about everything. Helena convinced me that you were trying to destroy our family for money, that your accusations were motivated by greed and resentment rather than genuine concern about criminal activity. I believed her because I wanted to believe her, because accepting your version of events would have meant admitting that I'd betrayed everything your mother stood for. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've done with the Foundation and the courage you showed in pursuing the truth even when it meant destroying your own family. Your mother would have been proud of the woman you've become. I love you, and I'm sorry for everything." I read the letter 3 times before deciding whether to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to maintain the clean separation between my new life and the family that had caused so much pain. But another part of me recognized that healing sometimes requires engaging with the people who hurt us, not to excuse their behavior but to understand it and move beyond it. My response was brief: "I received your letter and appreciate your honesty about what happened. I can't forgive you yet, but I'm working toward understanding why you made the choices you did. The Foundation is helping people who were hurt by the same network you worked with, and that feels like the best way to honor Mom's memory and turn something positive from all this destruction." I never heard back from him, but Connor told me that Richard had started working with federal prosecutors to provide information about other criminal networks he'd encountered during his years in the business. It wasn't redemption, but it was something resembling accountability. 2 years after the trial, Marcus and I began dating seriously. Our relationship was built on the foundation of having survived something terrible together, but also on genuine compatibility and shared values that had nothing to do with the crimes that brought us together. He proposed on the 2nd anniversary of the verdict, and I said yes without hesitation. Our wedding was small and private, attended by Connor, the core staff of the Foundation, and a few close friends who had supported us through the worst period of our lives. There were no traditional family members present, but the people who came were the family we'd chosen rather than the family we'd inherited. During the reception, Connor gave a speech that brought tears to my eyes. "Brianna taught me that real family isn't about blood or legal relationships. It's about the people who stand by you when the world falls apart, who believe in the truth even when it's painful, and who help you become the person you're meant to be rather than the person others expect you to be." The Foundation continued to grow, eventually expanding internationally to work with victims of trafficking and financial exploitation in 15 countries. The work was difficult and sometimes heartbreaking, but it gave meaning to everything we'd been through and helped transform personal tragedy into social impact. 3 years after the trial, Helena Foster died in federal prison. The official cause was listed as heart failure, but those of us who knew her history suspected that someone in the Russian network had finally decided she was too dangerous to keep alive. Her death brought a sense of closure that the trial verdict alone hadn't provided. Connor and I visited my mother's grave together on the 4th anniversary of her death's true revelation. We brought flowers and a letter we'd written together, telling her about the Foundation, about the lives we'd rebuilt, and about the justice we'd finally achieved in her name. It felt like the conversation we'd never been able to have when she was alive but had been working toward ever since learning the truth about her murder. Standing there in the cemetery, Connor and I both understood that we'd lost the family we'd grown up believing in but found something more valuable in the process. The knowledge that we could survive anything as long as we held on to the truth and supported each other through the consequences of pursuing it. The family that had been built on lies was gone forever, but the family we'd chosen to create was stronger because it was based on honesty, shared values, and the conscious decision to care for each other rather than the accident of shared genetics. 5 years have passed since that morning when I stood outside the federal courthouse, clutching evidence that would destroy the only family I'd ever known. Today, I'm standing in a completely different courthouse, this time as a victim's advocate helping another young woman testify against the people who stole her identity and exploited her trust. The cycle continues, but now I'm part of the solution rather than just another victim. The Foster Justice Foundation has helped over 3,000 survivors of financial exploitation and human trafficking. Our legal clinic has recovered $47 million in stolen assets, while our counseling programs have helped hundreds of people rebuild their psychological and emotional health after experiencing betrayal by people they trusted. Most importantly, our prevention programs have educated thousands of young people about the warning signs of financial manipulation and trafficking operations. Connor graduated from Columbia Business School last year and now serves as the foundation's executive director. His understanding of how financial systems can be manipulated for criminal purposes, combined with his personal experience of being victimized by family members, makes him uniquely qualified to help others navigate the complex intersection of family relationships and financial exploitation. He's also engaged to be married to Sarah Kim, a social worker who specializes in helping trafficking survivors, and their relationship gives me hope that it's possible to build healthy family bonds based on mutual respect and shared values. Marcus and I have been married for 3 years now, and our partnership has evolved from the crisis that brought us together into something deeper and more sustainable. He still practices law, but now focuses exclusively on cases involving financial crimes and victim advocacy. We've learned to balance the intensity of working with trauma survivors with the need to protect our own relationship from the emotional weight of so much pain and injustice. Last month, we adopted our first child, a 6-year-old girl named Emma whose parents were killed in a human trafficking operation connected to the same network that had used my father's real estate empire. Emma's journey to our family has been complicated by the trauma she experienced, but she's shown remarkable resilience and an ability to trust that gives us both hope for her future and inspiration for our work. I still think about my mother every day, but the grief has transformed from sharp pain into a gentle sadness mixed with gratitude for the time we had together and the values she instilled in me before her death. The foundation carries her maiden name, Martinez, as a way of honoring her memory and ensuring that her legacy lives on through the lives we're able to help. Richard died in federal prison 2 years ago. The official cause was listed as complications from diabetes, but those familiar with his case suspected that his ongoing cooperation with federal investigators had made him a target for the same criminal networks he'd once served. Connor and I attended his funeral, not out of forgiveness but out of recognition that he was still our father despite everything he'd done. The service was small and quiet, attended mostly by law enforcement officers who had worked with him on various investigations. Helena's criminal network was completely dismantled within 3 years of her death, with over 200 arrests in 15 countries. The investigation that began with my discovery of fraudulent bank accounts eventually led to the shutdown of trafficking operations that had enslaved thousands of people worldwide. Sometimes I wonder if my mother would be proud of what her death ultimately accomplished, though I know she would have preferred that justice could have been achieved without so much suffering. The most difficult part of this journey has been learning to live with the knowledge that the people who should have protected me were the ones who caused the most harm. Family is supposed to be the foundation of safety and trust, but for me it became the source of the greatest danger. Recovery has meant learning to create new definitions of family based on choice rather than genetics, commitment rather than obligation, and honesty rather than loyalty. Emma often asks about my parents and why she doesn't have grandparents like some of her friends. I've struggled with how to explain the complexities of our family history to a child who has already experienced more trauma than most adults. What I've settled on is a version of the truth appropriate for her age. Some people make choices that hurt others, even people they're supposed to love, and when that happens, the people who were hurt have to create new families with people who will treat them with kindness and respect. The financial recovery from Richard's criminal enterprises ultimately returned over $80 million to victims of the trafficking and money laundering operations. The Foster Justice Foundation received a significant portion of these assets, which allowed us to expand our programs internationally and establish partnerships with victim advocacy organizations around the world. In a strange way, the money that was stolen through such horrific means has been transformed into a tool for helping others heal and rebuild their lives. Connor and I have also used some of the recovered assets to establish a scholarship program for young people who have aged out of foster care or escaped trafficking situations. These survivors often lack the family support systems that most people take for granted, making it difficult for them to pursue higher education or establish stable careers. Our scholarship program provides not just financial assistance but also mentoring and psychological support to help recipients build the life skills necessary for long-term success. 3 months ago, I received a letter from a young woman named Ana Rodriguez who had been trafficked through the same network that used my father's properties. She'd escaped with the help of our foundation and was now studying social work at a community college in California. Her letter thanked me for having the courage to expose the people who had destroyed so many lives, but more importantly, it reminded me why this work matters. "You could have taken the money and stayed quiet," Ana wrote. "You could have protected your family relationships and avoided all the pain that came with telling the truth. But you chose to fight for people you'd never met, people like me who didn't have voices or power or anyone who cared what happened to us. You gave up your family so that other people could have a chance to build families of their own." Reading Anna's letter reminded me that the price of truth isn't always something we pay for ourselves. Sometimes the cost is measured in the lives we're able to save, the suffering we're able to prevent, and the hope we're able to restore for people who thought they'd lost everything. The little girl who once believed her father was a hero learned that heroes are more complicated than fairy tales suggest. Real heroism isn't about being perfect or protecting the people you love from all consequences. It's about choosing to do what's right even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted, and then finding the strength to build something better from the wreckage of what you've lost. I still miss the family I thought I had, but I'm grateful for the family I've chosen to create. Marcus, Connor, Emma, and the extended community of survivors and advocates who make up our chosen family have taught me that love isn't about unconditional acceptance of harmful behavior. It's about creating spaces where people can heal, grow, and become the best versions of themselves. As I finish writing this story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where telling the truth would cost you relationships with people you love? Have you ever had to choose between loyalty to family and loyalty to your own values? How do you find the courage to do what's right when the people closest to you are asking you to stay quiet about things that could help others? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your experiences and perspectives help all of us understand that we're not alone in facing these difficult choices. And if this story has touched you in some way, please consider hitting the like button to help it reach others who might need to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about courage, justice, and the complicated ways that families can both hurt and heal us. Share this video with someone who might need to know that it's possible to survive the destruction of everything you thought you knew about the people you love. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the most difficult periods of my life. I hope that sharing my story helps you find strength for whatever battles you're fighting in your own life. Remember that the truth is always worth pursuing, even when the cost seems unbearable. Sometimes the family you lose by telling the truth isn't worth keeping, and the family you find by living authentically is worth more than anything you could have protected by staying silent. Take care of yourselves, and never stop fighting for what's right, even when the people you love are on the wrong side of justice.